Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The bustling energy of the airport terminal wrapped around Ava Johnson like a heavy blanket as she stepped inside, rolling her sleek carry-on bag behind her. The scent of fresh coffee and baked pastries mingled with the metallic tang of the air-conditioned space, and the hum of countless voices created an indistinct cacophony. Ava paused for a moment, glancing at the departure board to confirm her flight details. Flight 827, first class, departure, 2 hours. A faint smile tugged at her lips as she adjusted her blazer and strode toward the check-in counter. Ava had always been meticulous in her planning, a trait that had carried her through countless challenges. This trip was no exception. The past few months had been a whirlwind of activity, with her nonprofit organization, Elevate, finally gaining international recognition. What had started as a modest grassroots initiative to provide educational opportunities for underprivileged children had blossomed into a global movement, thanks to her relentless drive and the efforts of her dedicated team. Today's flight marked the beginning of a new chapter. She was heading to London to deliver the keynote address at an international conference on education equity. As she approached the first-class check-in counter, she noticed the line was mercifully short. The sign above the counter read, First Class and Priority Check-in, gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. Behind the counter stood a middle-aged man with a name tag that read Brian. His slicked-back hair and stiff posture radiated an air of impatience. His eyes scanned the line as though calculating how quickly he could get through the day. Ava stepped forward when it was her turn, her smile warm and genuine. "Good morning," she greeted, sliding her ticket and ID across the counter. "I'm checking in for flight 827, first class." Brian barely looked at her as he picked up her documents, his eyes darting between the screen in front of him and her ID. His brows furrowed slightly, and he paused, as though something didn't quite compute. Finally, he looked up, his expression a mix of skepticism and condescension. "This must be a mistake," he said, his voice clipped. "First class, you said?" Ava's smile faltered but didn't disappear. "Yes, that's correct." Brian let out a faint, incredulous chuckle, shaking his head. "I don't think so, ma'am. First-class check-in is for passengers holding priority tickets. Economy check-in is over there." He gestured vaguely to a line on the other side of the terminal. For a moment, Ava was too stunned to respond. The implication of his words hung heavy in the air. She glanced at the people in line behind her, some pretending not to notice, others openly staring. The knot of discomfort in her chest tightened, but she quickly regained her composure. "There's no mistake," she said firmly, keeping her tone measured. "This is my ticket." Brian raised an eyebrow and scrutinized her ticket more closely. He leaned toward his computer and began typing, his fingers moving with exaggerated slowness. The seconds stretched into what felt like minutes as Ava stood there, her heart pounding with a mix of anger and humiliation. Finally, the printer whirred to life, spitting out her boarding pass. "Well," Brian muttered, sliding the boarding pass and her ID back across the counter. "It seems you're in the right place after all." Ava took her documents without a word, but as she turned to leave, she couldn't resist looking him in the eye. "Judging someone based on appearances," she said, her voice steady, "is never a good idea." Brian didn't respond, and Ava walked away, her head held high despite the sting of the encounter. She told herself she wouldn't let this ruin her day. After all, she had dealt with worse. Growing up in a low-income neighborhood where opportunities were scarce and expectations even scarcer, Ava had learned to rise above the assumptions and limitations others placed on her. As she approached the security checkpoint, Ava noticed more glances cast her way, some curious, others appraising. She placed her belongings on the conveyor belt and stepped through the metal detector, only to be pulled aside for a random screening. The uniformed officer asked her to open her bag and subjected her to a thorough pat-down. Ava complied without complaint, but the humiliation of being singled out again began to gnaw at her resolve. The officer rifled through Ava's bag, pausing when she came across a folder of neatly organized documents. One sheet caught her eye, a printed itinerary with the header International Conference on Education Equity, keynote speaker Ava Johnson. The officer's demeanor shifted slightly, her movements less brusque. "You're a speaker?" she asked, her voice tinged with surprise. "Yes," Ava replied curtly, her patience wearing thin. "Is there anything else you need?" The officer shook her head and handed Ava her bag. "No, you're good to go." Ava repacked her belongings and moved toward the terminal's first-class lounge, her frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. She scanned her boarding pass at the lounge entrance, where another employee looked her over with a similar air of skepticism, before finally allowing her in. Once inside, the plush seating and serene atmosphere offered some reprieve from the chaos of the terminal. Settling into a corner seat, Ava took a deep breath and opened her laptop. She needed to focus on her keynote address, a speech she had spent weeks preparing. But as she stared at the screen, the morning's events replayed in her mind. She thought about the countless times she had been underestimated, dismissed, or judged solely by her appearance. And while she had grown adept at navigating these moments, the weight of them never seemed to diminish. She resolved to weave these experiences into her speech. After all, her story wasn't just her own, it was a testament to the resilience and potential of countless individuals who had been written off by a society too quick to judge. Her keynote would be more than an appeal for education equity, it would be a call to action, a challenge to confront the biases that perpetuated inequality. Ava was deep in thought when a commotion outside the lounge caught her attention. Through the large windows overlooking the tarmac, she saw a sleek black private jet taxiing toward a reserved section of the airport. The aircraft's tail bore the logo of a prestigious philanthropic organization, the very one sponsoring the conference she was heading to. A small team of staff and security personnel gathered near the jet, their movements efficient and purposeful. Her phone buzzed with a text from the conference organizer, "Ms. Johnson, your private transport has arrived. Please proceed to the VIP exit at your convenience." Ava smiled to herself, the knot of frustration in her chest finally loosening. She packed up her things and made her way to the exit, her stride confident. The morning's indignities had been a reminder of the work still to be done, but they would not define her. Today, she would rise above them, literally and figuratively. The private jet awaited, a symbol of how far she had come and how much further she was determined to go. Ava settled into the plush leather chair of the first-class lounge, her laptop open before her and a steaming cup of herbal tea at her side. She tried to focus on her keynote speech, revising her notes and rehearsing her delivery in her head. But the echoes of her earlier encounters gnawed at her. She had long since grown used to moments like these, small indignities cloaked in politeness, prejudice dressed in procedure. Yet, no matter how often they occurred, they still stung. She glanced at her watch. There was just over an hour before boarding, and she still had time to tweak her presentation. Her speech was a call to action, a blend of her personal journey and a broader appeal to bridge gaps in education and opportunity. It was meant to inspire, but as she reread her opening lines, she realized they lacked the fire she felt now. Her morning had reminded her why this work mattered so deeply. It wasn't just about giving people tools to succeed, it was about dismantling the biases that told them they couldn't. She began typing furiously, reworking her introduction. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she channeled her frustration into a powerful anecdote about her upbringing. Growing up in a modest neighborhood, Ava had been underestimated countless times. Teachers who assumed she wasn't capable of excelling, employers who doubted her potential, each obstacle had fueled her determination. She knew her audience in Paris would relate to this, many of them leaders who had overcome their own battles. By the time she finished rewriting, her speech felt sharper, more authentic. It was her story, unapologetically. Ava leaned back, satisfied, and sipped her tea. Outside the lounge's large glass windows, the hum of activity on the tarmac was constant. Planes taxied to and from gates, baggage handlers moved in choreographed efficiency, and the occasional private jet landed with an understated elegance that drew envious glances from travelers in the terminal. She noticed a stir near the lounge entrance and turned to see what was happening. A woman in a crisp uniform, one of the airport's VIP liaisons, had entered. She was speaking to the receptionist and gesturing in Ava's direction. Ava's curiosity piqued as the receptionist nodded and pointed toward her. A moment later, the liaison approached her with a professional smile. "Ms. Johnson," the woman said, her voice warm and deferential, "I'm here to escort you to the tarmac. Your aircraft has arrived." Ava's brows rose slightly. She had known the organization sponsoring her trip would arrange special accommodations, but she hadn't expected such fanfare. "Thank you," she said, gathering her belongings. As she followed the woman out of the lounge, she could feel the eyes of other passengers on her. Some were curious, others surprised, but Ava ignored them. She had long since learned that proving herself didn't require their approval. The liaison led her down a private corridor, bypassing the usual boarding gates and taking her to a secure elevator. The doors opened onto a sunlit area of the tarmac reserved for private jets. The sight before her was striking, a sleek, black jet with the distinctive logo of the Global Philanthropy Network emblazoned on its tail. A small crew waited near the aircraft, their uniforms crisp and their movements purposeful. Ava paused for a moment, taking it all in. This was the culmination of years of hard work, long nights, personal sacrifices, and unwavering dedication to her vision. She thought back to the young girl she had once been, sitting in a cramped classroom with outdated textbooks, dreaming of a future far beyond her immediate surroundings. That girl could never have imagined this moment. As she approached the jet, a voice called out behind her. "Wait. Ms. Johnson." She turned to see Brian, the check-in agent from earlier, jogging toward her, his expression a mix of panic and confusion. His previously smug demeanor had vanished, replaced by an almost comical disbelief. He stopped a few feet away, panting slightly. I didn't realize," he began, but his words faltered as his eyes darted from Ava to the jet and back again. Ava regarded him coolly, her earlier irritation resurfacing. "Is there something I can help you with?" she asked, her tone even but edged with a quiet authority. Brian seemed to struggle for words. "I just wanted to apologize," he said finally, his voice subdued. "I didn't mean to. I didn't know who you were." Ava tilted her head, considering his words. "You didn't know who I was," she repeated. "And that's why you felt it was acceptable to treat me the way you did." He looked away, clearly uncomfortable. "I was just doing my job," he mumbled. "No," Ava said firmly, her voice cutting through the noise of the tarmac. "Doing your job would have meant treating every passenger with respect, regardless of what you assumed about them. This isn't about me or who I am. It's about how you see people who don't fit your expectations." Brian opened his mouth as if to argue, but no words came. Ava could see the realization dawning on him, the weight of his actions finally sinking in. She didn't wait for him to respond. Instead, she turned and walked toward the jet, her stride purposeful. The crew greeted her warmly, taking her bags and guiding her up the steps. Inside, the cabin was a masterpiece of luxury and functionality. Plush leather seats, polished wood accents, and state-of-the-art technology created an atmosphere of both comfort and efficiency. Ava settled into her seat, exhaling deeply. The door closed, and moments later, the jet began to taxi toward the runway. As the aircraft lifted into the sky, Ava gazed out the window at the shrinking airport below. Her mind drifted to the conference ahead, to the people she would meet and the stories they would share. She thought about the challenges she had faced, not just today but throughout her life, and how each one had shaped her into the woman she had become. By the time the jet leveled out at cruising altitude, Ava felt a sense of peace. She wasn't just flying to Paris to give a speech. She was flying toward a future she had built with her own hands, a future where moments like the one with Brian wouldn't hold her back, but would fuel her resolve to keep pushing forward. She opened her laptop once more, adding a final line to her speech. It was a simple but powerful statement, one that captured the essence of her journey. Our worth isn't defined by the labels others place on us. It's defined by the impact we make, the lives we touch, and the legacy we leave behind. With a satisfied smile, Ava closed her laptop and leaned back in her seat. The world awaited her, and she was ready. As the jet cruised above the clouds, Ava allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. The soft hum of the engines and the serene expanse of blue sky beyond the windows created a cocoon of calm. It was a stark contrast to the chaos and indignities she had faced earlier at the airport. Those experiences had long become a part of her life, a series of hurdles that she had learned to clear with poise. Yet, each instance left its mark, fueling her determination to break down barriers not just for herself, but for others who faced similar challenges. Ava turned her gaze away from the window and glanced around the cabin. The opulence of her surroundings reminded her of how far she had come. She thought about the early days of her nonprofit, Elevate, when the idea of flying on a private jet or delivering a keynote at a global conference seemed like an unattainable dream. Back then, her office was a small, rented space with second-hand furniture and a single assistant who doubled as everything from a secretary to a fundraiser. Ava had spent countless nights hunched over a desk, strategizing ways to secure funding, connect with communities, and expand the organization's reach. Her thoughts shifted to the people who had inspired her along the way. There was Mrs. Howard, her high school English teacher, who had been the first to see her potential and encourage her to aim higher. And then there was Marcus, her mentor during college, who had taught her how to navigate a world that wasn't always welcoming to someone like her. These figures loomed large in her memory, their lessons echoing in her mind as she worked to carve out her place in the world. The chime of the seatbelt sign interrupted her reverie, signaling that they were about to descend. Ava felt a familiar flutter of anticipation. The conference in Paris was more than just an opportunity to share her story, it was a chance to connect with like-minded individuals and galvanize a global movement toward education equity. She had spent weeks preparing her speech, poring over data, and crafting a narrative that would resonate with her audience. She hoped her words would inspire action and ignite a sense of urgency in those who had the power to make a difference. As the jet touched down on the runway, Ava felt a renewed sense of purpose. The city of Paris spread out before her, its iconic landmarks visible in the distance. The private terminal where they landed was a hive of activity, with staff moving efficiently to accommodate the arriving aircraft. A sleek black car waited for Ava on the tarmac, its driver holding a sign with her name. She descended the steps of the jet with the same quiet confidence she had carried into the airport that morning, her head held high. The ride to the conference venue was brief but scenic, the car weaving through the elegant streets of Paris. Ava took in the sights, the tree-lined boulevards, the bustling cafes, and the grandeur of the historic architecture. It was a city that symbolized creativity, resilience, and progress, all values that aligned with her mission. When the car pulled up to the entrance of the conference center, Ava stepped out to find a throng of attendees already gathering. The atmosphere was electric, a palpable sense of excitement and anticipation filling the air. Inside, the venue was a masterpiece of modern design, with soaring ceilings and sleek glass walls that flooded the space with natural light. Ava was greeted by a team of organizers who ushered her into a private lounge reserved for keynote speakers. There, she met other leaders and visionaries who had flown in from around the world to share their insights and collaborate on solutions to pressing global challenges. One of the speakers, a tall woman with silver hair and an air of quiet authority, introduced herself as Dr. Elena Moreau, a renowned economist who had dedicated her career to tackling systemic inequality. Elena had heard of Ava's work and was eager to learn more. The two women quickly fell into a deep conversation, exchanging ideas and sharing stories of their respective journeys. "What you've built with Elevate is extraordinary," Elena said, her admiration genuine. "You've managed to not only address the immediate needs of underserved communities, but also create a sustainable model for long-term impact." Ava smiled, humbled by the praise. "Thank you, but it's been a collective effort. I've been fortunate to work with incredible people who share the same vision." Their conversation was interrupted by a staff member who informed Ava that it was time to take the stage. Ava felt a rush of adrenaline as she made her way to the auditorium, the sound of applause growing louder as she approached. The room was packed, every seat filled with people from diverse backgrounds, educators, policymakers, philanthropists, and activists, all united by a common goal. As Ava stepped onto the stage, the applause swelled, a wave of energy that seemed to lift her. She paused for a moment, letting the audience's enthusiasm sink in before she began. The stage lights were warm, and the vast auditorium felt both intimate and expansive. Ava's voice was steady as she opened with a story from her childhood, painting a vivid picture of the challenges she had faced and the dreams that had driven her forward. Her words flowed effortlessly, weaving together personal anecdotes, compelling data, and a clear call to action. She spoke of the systemic barriers that kept millions of children out of school, the urgent need for investment in education infrastructure, and the transformative power of empowering young minds. She shared the successes of Elevate, illustrating how even small interventions could have a ripple effect that changed lives and communities. The audience was captivated, their expressions ranging from thoughtful to inspired. Ava could see heads nodding in agreement, and at key moments, the room erupted in applause. She ended her speech with a powerful message: the future belongs to those who dare to challenge the status quo. It belongs to those who believe in the potential of every child, regardless of where they come from or what they look like. Together, we can build a world where education is not a privilege, but a fundamental right. The standing ovation that followed was thunderous, echoing through the auditorium and spilling into the corridors outside. Ava felt a surge of emotion as she stepped back from the podium, bowing her head in gratitude. She had poured her heart into this moment, and the response was more than she could have hoped for. Backstage, Ava was approached by several attendees who wanted to connect, collaborate, and support her work. One of them was a prominent tech entrepreneur who offered to partner with Elevate to develop innovative learning platforms for underserved communities. Another was a government official from an African nation who invited Ava to pilot her programs in their country. By the end of the day, Ava was exhausted but exhilarated. She had not only shared her vision but also forged meaningful connections that could amplify her impact. As she returned to her hotel that evening, she reflected on how far she had come and how much further there was to go. The journey was far from over, but she was ready for whatever lay ahead. The next morning, sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Ava's hotel suite, casting a golden glow over the room. Ava stretched and took a deep breath, feeling a rare sense of calm. The conference's first day had been an undeniable success, but she knew the true work lay ahead. Today would be dedicated to smaller breakout sessions, intimate discussions where real strategies could take shape. These sessions were where ideas were refined, partnerships forged, and plans set into motion. As she got ready, Ava reflected on the whirlwind of the previous evening. After her keynote, she'd spent hours in conversations with influential leaders who were eager to collaborate. The tech entrepreneur, Daniel Lee, had been particularly enthusiastic. He envisioned a partnership between his company and Elevate that would bring state-of-the-art virtual learning platforms to remote areas, bridging the gap between underserved communities and quality education. Ava had also been approached by Dr. Amal Okoro, an education reform advocate who wanted to adapt Elevate's model to fit the cultural and logistical needs of West Africa. Ava's heart swelled with pride as she thought about the possibilities, but she also felt the weight of responsibility. Every conversation she'd had made it clear that the world was watching, waiting to see how she would use this momentum. She knew she couldn't let them down. She arrived at the conference center just as the first breakout session was about to begin. The session was focused on cross-sector collaboration, bringing together leaders from education, technology, and government to discuss how they could work together to create sustainable solutions. Ava was one of 3 panelists, seated alongside Daniel Lee and Dr. Okoro. The moderator, a journalist known for her incisive questions, introduced Ava first. Ms. Ava Johnson needs no introduction after last night's inspiring keynote, but for those just joining us, Ava is the founder and CEO of Elevate, a non-profit organization revolutionizing access to education in underserved communities worldwide. Ava nodded, acknowledging the warm applause that followed. As the session began, she listened intently to her fellow panelists, taking notes and formulating her thoughts. When it was her turn to speak, she leaned into the microphone, her voice steady and clear. Collaboration, she began, is the cornerstone of innovation. At Elevate, we've learned that no single organization, no matter how passionate or well-funded, can tackle the systemic issues in education alone. It takes a village, a global village, to bring about real change. And that means governments, private enterprises, and nonprofits must come together, not as competitors, but as partners. She paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. One of the most impactful projects we've undertaken involved partnering with a local government in Kenya to build solar-powered learning hubs in rural villages. These hubs not only provided access to education but also doubled as community centers where adults could learn new skills. The success of that initiative came from the collaboration between local leaders, international donors, and tech companies who provided the necessary tools. Daniel Lee chimed in, and that's where technology becomes the great equalizer. When we provide the tools, whether it's hardware, software, or internet access, we're not just giving students the ability to learn, we're giving them the ability to dream. Imagine a child in a remote village who has never seen a computer, now accessing the same online courses as a student in a major city. That's the kind of transformation Ava and I are talking about. Dr. Okoro added her perspective, emphasizing the importance of culturally sensitive solutions. We can't simply impose one-size-fits-all solutions and expect them to work everywhere. What works in Kenya might not work in West Africa or Southeast Asia. That's why partnerships like the ones Ava is fostering are so crucial. They allow for adaptability and respect for local contexts. The discussion was dynamic, with the audience actively engaging through questions and comments. Ava felt invigorated, her passion reignited by the exchange of ideas. By the end of the session, she had several new connections and a growing list of potential projects to explore. Afterward, Ava found herself in a small lounge area reserved for speakers and key stakeholders. She was nursing a cup of coffee when Daniel approached her, his energy as infectious as ever. Ava, I've been thinking about something, he said, sitting across from her. Your hubs in Kenya, what if we scaled that idea globally? My company has the resources to manufacture portable tech solutions, and I know we can secure funding for large-scale deployment. Ava considered his proposal carefully. Scaling globally is the dream, she said, but we have to be strategic. Each region has its own challenges: political instability, lack of infrastructure, cultural barriers. If we try to do too much too fast, we risk losing the impact we're aiming for. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. What if we started with pilot programs in 3 regions? Test the concept, refine it, and then expand? That, Ava said, smiling, sounds like a plan worth exploring. As they continued discussing logistics, Ava's phone buzzed with a message from her assistant back home. It was a reminder that she had a virtual meeting later that day with her team in the United States. Ava had made it a point to stay connected to her grassroots efforts, even as she moved into global advocacy. She knew that the success of Elevate depended on the tireless work of her team on the ground. Excusing herself from the lounge, Ava found a quiet corner to set up her laptop for the call. Her team's faces appeared on the screen, their enthusiasm evident even through the pixels. How's Paris? Her operations manager, Lisa, asked, her voice warm with familiarity. It's incredible, Ava said, updating them on the conference's highlights. She also shared Daniel's proposal for scaling the learning hubs and sought their input. The team brainstormed ideas, offering insights that only those deeply entrenched in the day-to-day operations could provide. The meeting ended on a high note, with a renewed sense of purpose driving the team forward. As Ava closed her laptop, she felt a pang of homesickness, but also a deep appreciation for the people who had been with her since the beginning. They were her foundation, the reason she could dream so big. Later that evening, Ava attended a gala dinner hosted by the conference organizers. The event was a dazzling affair, with chandeliers casting a warm glow over the elegantly decorated hall. Attendees mingled over glasses of champagne, their conversations buzzing with excitement about the day's sessions. Ava found herself seated at a table with a mix of government officials, philanthropists, and business leaders. Among them was Minister Adebayo, a charismatic leader from Nigeria who had been following Ava's work. As they spoke, he expressed interest in bringing Elevate to his country, emphasizing the need for innovative solutions to address Nigeria's education crisis. "We have millions of children out of school," he said, his voice heavy with concern. "Your hubs could be a game changer. Let's set up a meeting to discuss how we can make this happen." Ava agreed, her mind already racing with possibilities. She knew that expanding to Nigeria would be a monumental task, but the potential impact was too great to ignore. As the night wore on, Ava couldn't help but feel a profound sense of gratitude. The journey that had brought her here was far from easy, but it had been worth every sacrifice. She thought about the young girl she had once been, dreaming of a better world, and how that dream was now becoming a reality, not just for her, but for countless others. When she finally returned to her hotel, exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. But as she lay in bed, staring at the city lights outside her window, she felt an unshakable resolve. The work ahead would be challenging, but Ava was ready. She wasn't just building a movement, she was building a legacy. The morning of Ava's final day at the conference dawned with a crisp Parisian chill. She stood on the balcony of her hotel suite, looking out at the city that had played host to one of the most transformative experiences of her life. The Eiffel Tower loomed in the distance, framed by a clear blue sky, its timeless elegance a reminder of what humanity could achieve when united by vision and determination. Ava sipped her coffee, savoring the moment before the day's chaos began. Today, she would cement partnerships, finalize commitments, and leave her mark on a global stage. Her phone buzzed with a series of reminders from her assistant. Meetings had been scheduled back-to-back, first with Daniel Lee to iron out the pilot program details for their global tech-based education hubs, then with Minister Adebayo to discuss the implementation of Elevate's model in Nigeria. A luncheon with key philanthropists followed, capped by her participation in a closing panel that would be live-streamed to millions around the world. As Ava prepared herself, she felt a mix of exhilaration and weighty responsibility. The past few days had been a whirlwind of opportunity and inspiration, but she knew that real change required action, not just talk. Her keynote had sparked a movement within the conference, but now it was time to take that spark and ignite lasting flames of progress. Her first meeting with Daniel Lee took place in one of the conference center's sleek glass-walled rooms. He arrived with a small team, armed with prototypes and detailed proposals. The energy in the room was electric as they discussed how to adapt the learning hubs for different regions. Daniel's team had developed solar-powered tablets equipped with preloaded educational content in multiple languages, designed to function in areas with limited or no internet access. "Our goal," Daniel explained, "is to make these tablets as intuitive and versatile as possible. They'll come with built-in teacher training modules, so local educators can maximize their use, and we're working on partnerships to ensure continuous updates to the software." Ava leaned forward, her mind racing with possibilities. This is exactly the kind of innovation we need. But let's not forget the human element. These tools are only as effective as the ecosystems we build around them. We'll need local leaders, educators, and families to be part of the process from the beginning. Daniel nodded. Agreed. That's where your experience comes in. Elevate has already built those ecosystems. We just need to integrate the technology into your existing framework. By the end of the meeting, they had outlined a comprehensive plan for the pilot programs, set to launch in Kenya, Nigeria, and a rural region of India within the next year. Ava felt a surge of hope. This partnership had the potential to change millions of lives. Next was her meeting with Minister Adebayo. He greeted her warmly, his charisma and passion evident from the start. "Ms. Johnson," he began, "I've been following your work closely. Nigeria faces an education crisis on a massive scale, but I believe your model could be a turning point for us." Ava listened as he detailed the challenges: overcrowded classrooms, underfunded schools, and a lack of access to basic resources in rural areas. She empathized deeply, having encountered similar issues in the communities Elevate served. "Our biggest hurdle," Adebayo continued, "is reaching the children who live in the most remote regions. But I believe your hubs, combined with our government's commitment, can bridge that gap." Ava appreciated his candidness. Minister, I'm honored by your faith in our work. But if we're going to do this, it has to be a true partnership. Elevate's success comes from working closely with communities, understanding their needs, and tailoring solutions accordingly. It's not about imposing a model, it's about co-creating one. Adebayo smiled. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. Let's set up a task force to begin planning immediately. I'll allocate resources and introduce you to key stakeholders when you're ready. As they shook hands, Ava felt the gravity of what they were about to undertake. Nigeria's scale and complexity presented challenges unlike any she'd faced before, but the potential impact was enormous. This wasn't just about providing education, it was about transforming futures. The luncheon with philanthropists proved equally fruitful. Ava found herself seated beside Helena Kravitz, a billionaire investor known for her focus on social impact. Helena had been deeply moved by Ava's keynote and wanted to fund Elevate's next phase of growth. I'm not just interested in writing a check, Helena said over a plate of delicate salmon tartare. I want to be actively involved. My foundation has resources and expertise in scaling programs globally, and I think we can help you expand faster and smarter. Ava welcomed the offer. Helena, I've always believed that financial support is only one piece of the puzzle. Having someone with your experience on our side would be invaluable. They spent the rest of the lunch discussing how Helena's foundation could provide both funding and strategic guidance. By the time dessert arrived, Helena had committed to an initial $10 million investment, with the promise of more to follow once the pilot programs demonstrated success. The day culminated in the closing panel, which brought together some of the conference's most influential figures, including Ava. The auditorium was packed, and thousands more tuned in online as the panelists discussed the future of education, innovation, and global equity. Ava's contributions were met with widespread praise. She spoke passionately about the need for systemic change, calling on governments, corporations, and individuals to recognize education as a universal right, not a privilege. It's not enough to provide resources, she said, her voice resonating through the hall. We need to dismantle the barriers that keep children from accessing those resources. We need to challenge the biases and systemic inequities that tell certain communities they're not worth investing in. Change starts with us, with the decisions we make and the priorities we set. When the panel ended, the audience gave a standing ovation, and Ava felt the weight of their expectations. As she stepped off the stage, a young woman approached her, visibly emotional. Ms. Johnson, she said, her voice trembling, I'm from a small village in Ghana. Your story, it's my story too. You've shown me that I can dream bigger than I ever thought possible. Thank you. Ava was deeply moved. She took the young woman's hands in hers and said, your dreams are valid, and your voice matters. Never let anyone tell you otherwise. That night, as Ava returned to her hotel, she felt an overwhelming mix of exhaustion and fulfillment. The conference had exceeded her wildest expectations, but it was only the beginning. The partnerships she had forged, the commitments she had secured, and the lives she had touched all pointed to a future brimming with possibility. Sitting by the window, she gazed out at the city lights and allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. The path ahead would be arduous, but Ava was ready. She had built something far greater than a nonprofit, she had built a movement. And as long as there were children waiting for an education, waiting for a chance to rise, she would keep pushing forward. Tomorrow, she would board another plane, heading back to the grassroots work that had started it all. But tonight, she allowed herself to savor the victory. It wasn't hers alone, it belonged to everyone who believed in the power of education to change the world.